interestingly enough, a lot of the issues that we saw 25 years ago still exist today. Which is kind of sad because companies don't see the governance process around introducing parts as being sexy. They just see the software tools that engineers use to design parts as being really cool. They need to make sure that they have these other governance tools in place to keep costs down. And I think that's starting to become more recognized, especially by the larger A&D companies. So I think the trend is that eventually the Blue Origins, the SpaceXs are going to follow suit and recognize that they need to invest more in upfront to make sure they're introducing the right parts to their rockets. Well, I started as a mechanical engineer designing parts for a company, and I realized that wasn't my calling, and I wanted to be a bigger part of a business. Inevitably, I became an entrepreneur and started this company, hard to believe, 25 years ago.
Wow. You were way at the forefront of what you're doing now. If you started 25 years ago, you saw this coming way back. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So what you are doing with your company is really interesting to me. And again, you were really ahead of a big, big trend. Tell me a bit about what Convergence Data does.
So we offer, I consider it a basic service, which is we basically establish catalogs of parts and products. And for our aerospace companies, going all the way back to the days when we started with companies like Boeing and Northrop Grumman over 20 years ago, we build catalogs of primarily electronic parts. Electronic parts are a major part of the bill of material for a lot of these A&D companies, and they're expensive. So you want to make sure you have a catalog of the preferred parts. It makes it real easy for engineers to find the right parts and for procurement to buy the right parts.
Right.
So we've been doing that for the last 25 years. And A&D has kind of always had the lead in this area. They've always had strong governance.
A&D, sorry, what do you mean by that?
So aerospace and defense.
Okay, just want to make sure.
they're kind of pioneers for a lot of the technologies in building products, from product lifecycle management to some of the work that we do. They had parts catalogs before we even showed up 25 years ago. So it's they are the pioneers, and we've kind of learned from them and built our business over the last 25 years to service other manufacturing verticals.
Fantastic. So you're taking those best practices and establishing them in a very dynamic way, it sounds like, especially since it's a SaaS solution, if I understand correctly.
It's a SaaS solution, correct.
All right. So can you maybe give me a sense of the landscape of before you all entered the scene, what things were like and how you have changed things? Well,
I think the best way to look at it is a lot of the pain points, we call it, that these manufacturing companies have are high costs. Their products are costing too much. It's taking too long to get these products to market. And a lot of it has to do with not having a governance process in place for selecting parts, making it real easy for engineers to find a preferred part, add it to their bill of material, and encouraging engineers to reuse parts. And when that's not happening, and you don't have governance in place, you end up with unnecessary high costs, way too many parts, way too many suppliers.
Right, and procurement does not like that.
And procurement is downstream of engineering, and they inherit this mess. And they're racing to onboard suppliers they shouldn't probably be onboarding for parts they shouldn't be having to buy because there's no governance process in place. So that's really the pain points that we solve for a company. So for engineering, making it easy for them to find a part, giving them the data they need, give them the search engine, adopting classification, putting these parts into their PLM system with classification, just making it easy for them to find parts so they're not introducing unnecessary parts or duplicate parts, which happens all the time. And then procurement, just giving them the information they need to find the right suppliers, set up long-term agreements with suppliers, get the best pricing. And just make their job easier versus onboarding unnecessary parts and ending up with high-costing suppliers they probably didn't want to onboard. It kind of snowballs as you get downstream of where the new parts are created.
It's a really interesting place to be right now, especially where you all are. You must have a very, really complex view of where the market is going right now, especially given, it's surrounding us right now, how much the industry is just ballooning and how much demand there is for all sorts of specialized parts and on these very challenging timelines. Go ahead.
If you look at all the companies that are here at the SpaceCom conference here in Orlando, they're mainly suppliers that provide highly advanced machine parts.
Yeah.
So that's good and bad. I mean, for the OEMs, for the Blue Origins, the SpaceXs, they want to make sure that the parts they're building are the right parts.
Right, yep.
And could they have reused a part versus issuing a custom part that I know they're spending a lot of money for. Some of our customers spend over $2,000 for a single washer because the procurement doesn't have the ability to check the price because they can't find similar washers from similar suppliers.
Wow, yeah.
And that's why the rockets are costing so much to build. It's a race to space to build those rockets, and they're creating unnecessary parts. There's no governance process in place. So it's concerning especially for these space companies. They're really startups compared to like a Boeing and Northrop, right?
Yeah.
They've grown fast, and they build their products really fast, and they probably have parts they shouldn't be ordering because they're working so quickly.
Yeah.
So by putting a governance process in place and slowing them down, getting them to reuse parts, that's going to save them a lot when it gets to procurement, when it gets to supply chain, when it gets to releasing that rocket. There should be a lot less quality issues because you've got parts that have high quality from preferred suppliers. And that's the big issue I see right now with a lot of the space companies.
I'm wondering about barriers, especially for a lot of these smaller, not necessarily the suppliers, but for the smaller startups. I mean, raising capital is extraordinarily difficult. This is not a cheap business to be in. It's got high risk. I'm wondering if you have advice, or I mean, you sort of touched on it a little bit, but for those smaller startups that are really trying to make their way into the industry.
Yeah, I think for the OEMs working with the startups, they want to make sure they do a risk analysis and make sure that they can truly produce the products and deliver against the quality.
Yes.
And when you have lots of suppliers, and a lot of these are startups, they probably don't meet a lot of those requirements, and they find out, unfortunately, the hard way.
Yeah.
And it delays rockets from being built and launched. So that's a concerning issue. And I think if they had less parts to manage, this issue would be smaller.
Reducing complexity.
Yeah,
right?
reducing
Absolutely.
complexity,
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, given that your company's been around for 25 years, what changes have you seen in the industry in that time, especially as it pertains to basically everything you've been mentioning about procurement and supply? Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, interestingly enough, a lot of the issues that we saw 25 years ago still exist today, which is kind of sad because companies don't see the governance process around introducing parts as being sexy. They just see the software tools that engineers use to design parts as being really cool. They need to make sure that they have these other governance tools in place to keep costs down.
Yeah.
And I think that's starting to become more recognized, especially by the larger A&D companies.
Yeah.
So I think the trend is that eventually the Blue Origins, the SpaceXs are going to follow suit and recognize that they need to invest more in upfront to make sure they're introducing the right parts to their rockets. So I think that's the big trend I'm seeing.
That's interesting that you mentioned that's been present for all this time, and yet, is it a cultural issue between like engineering first versus a procurement versus engineering mentality?
I think you hit the nail on the head. Engineering and procurement, they typically don't work together.
No, they do not.
And when it comes to things like purchase parts, really, especially the high spend, like for space companies, it's valves, right? They spend billions on valves. And if you get engineering and procurement working together, managing those categories and determining what is an acceptable valve, and working together and managing the spend on those categories, they're going to be a lot more successful. But today, it's engineer designs a part, throws it over the wall to procurement. There's no discussion.
It's adversarial at best in many cases. Yeah.
They're not working together.
Yeah.
So they've got to, I think from an organizational perspective, getting them working together, managing. We see that in our more advanced manufacturing companies, those groups work together more closely.
Yeah. So that is definitely a best practice to be adopting in that case. It's amazing. When I mentioned to you before we started recording that a long time ago when I first started my career, it was in procurement. And I remember it was a lot of this conversation I was having with people about why don't people partner more with procurement? There's so much efficiency to be made there. But I know my father was an engineer. I'm married to an engineer. I get it. I hear these conversations at home all the time about, procurement getting in the way. Yeah. But it is a best practice for a reason to be way more cooperative and working together. So
there is definitely design work to be done, and there's also unnecessary design work that shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
And I think that having a governance process in place and directing engineers towards where the value add design should be versus you need to be reusing standard parts over here. I think if they can manage that, walk that line and work with procurement and make the better decisions, these issues you see with trying to launch rockets are going to start to decline.
Yeah.
Right now, it's not great. The cost of rockets are high. They have a lot of quality issues, and it's usually due to the decisions they made on the parts that they release.
I'm very curious, when you're speaking to fellow C-level executives, because this I feel is also, what is the message that you want them to understand? Because I feel like when you're talking to a CEO, it's a different message than a team of engineers about this.
So for a CEO, the biggest expense for a manufacturing company is the direct material expense. And it's the parts they put into their products. They have a recurring expenditure. They're not like indirect, where you buy them once. They're going into your product, and they're going in high volumes. And that's your highest cost as a manufacturing company. So it's important that they have engineering and procurement working together, kind of managing that cost. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they're not going to achieve the margins they want to achieve. They're not going to get products out the door at the rate they want to go and do. The higher up we get in the company, the more they understand our value proposition.
Right, yep.
When we come in at a lower level with engineering, they're like, why do we need to worry about this? It's not our problem. We're probably talking to the wrong people, because it's the people downstream of engineering that inherit the problems. So I think it's more of an operations issue that needs to be addressed.
I was going to say, it sounds like there's some messaging that needs to get through from top down on some of that, for sure.
Absolutely.
For sure. Yeah. I'm very curious, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to address to the audience, or just sort of open forum? Is there anything you wanted to mention?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You don't have to jump into this all at once. I mean, we have partnerships with third-party data providers like IHS and Silicon Expert. Mm-hmm. And we could very quickly get a catalog set up for electronic components. And that's like a quick win, because that's a high-spend area. So that's a good way to kind of jump in, and then you start to go after other high-spend categories like mechanical parts and electromechanical parts. So you don't have to try to do it all at once. Go after the high-spend areas first, where the quality issues are, where you have too many parts and suppliers.
Be strategic. Makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today.
We're excited to be here, so thanks for having us.
Appreciate you joining me.